You hear the scream before you understand a traw, torn from a throat unused to such sound, echoing off stone walls meant for prayer. The boots are louder than the bells now. Heavy, deliberate, moving through corridors where only soft footsteps belonged. Your hands clutch at fabric, the rough wool habit that named you, that separated you from the world outside these walls. But the world has come inside, and it smells of sweat and steel and something else you cannot name because you have lived your entire adult life behind these walls, sheltered from such knowledge. The door you thought was locked splinters. Wood screams against iron. And in that moment, watching shadows fill the doorway, you understand with terrible clarity, sanctuary means nothing when no one is left to honor it. Before we go deeper into what happened in those terrible days, I'd love to know where you're watching from. It genuinely amazes me that stories from centuries past can reach people across the entire world. All of us trying to understand what humans are capable of in their darkest hours. The city was Rome. The year was 1527. And what unfolded over 8 days in May would be remembered not just as military catastrophe, but as a moral collapse so complete that even hardened diplomats struggled to find words for their reports. The sack of Rome, as history would call it, was not merely an act of war, it was the systematic unraveling of everything the city claimed to represent. Churches were desecrated. Palaces were gutted. Art that had survived 1,000 years was destroyed in hours. And among the city's most vulnerable victims were women who had chosen lives of prayer, cloistered behind convent walls that proved no barrier at all when discipline died and hunger for plunder consumed an unpaid army. The soldiers who descended on Rome that spring were a fractured coalition's Spanish tercios, hardened by decades of Italian campaigns. German landsknechts drawn from the mercenary companies of the north, Italian condottieri, whose loyalty extended exactly as far as their last payment. What united them was not devotion to the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, whose banner they nominally carried, but something far more primal: months without pay, commanders dead or absent, and the knowledge that beyond Rome's walls lay wealth that existed nowhere else in Europe. Contemporary chronicles describe the approach not as ordered military advance, but as something closer to a flood, unstoppable and indiscriminate. When the walls were breached on May 6th, what poured into the streets was not an army, but a swarm of armed men who had ceased to recognize authority of any kind. The commanding general, Charles de Bourbon, died in the initial assault shot through the chest as he scaled a ladder. With his death went the last thread of command structure. What followed was not conquest, but feeding frenzy. The convents scattered throughout Rome were, in one sense, fortresses of faith-thick walls. Heavy doors, lives organized around ritual and separation from the secular world. Some had stood for centuries, accumulating generations of donated wealth. The women inside ranged from daughters of the highest nobility to merchants, children whose families had scraped together modest dowries. What they shared was a profound vulnerability. No weapons, no military training, no escape routes, and a lifetime of conditioning that taught obedience and withdrawal rather than resistance. But they held something that made them targets beyond their defenselessness. The convents contained tangible wealth, liturgical silver, gold-threaded vestments, illuminated manuscripts whose jeweled covers alone were worth fortunes, coins and bonds meant to sustain the communities for generations. To the soldiers breaching their doors, these women represented a concentration of everything this campaign had promised them: riches. Yes, but also something more abstract and more dangerous. They were symbols of a church grown wealthy on the backs of peasants, embodiments of a moral authority that Protestant soldiers had been taught to despise, and most immediately, they were human beings who could not fight back. Sister Caterina was 23 years old when they came. We know her name because she survived long enough to give testimony to a bishop's inquiry 3 months later. Her words preserved in Vatican archives that would sit essentially untouched for 4 centuries. She described the sound first, not the shouting, but the breaking. Wood splitting, metal grinding against metal. the percussive crash of overturned furniture as men searched for hidden wealth. The sisters had gathered in the chapel, she said, because they did not know what else to do. Prayer was their only language for crisis. Some knelt before the altar. Others wept silently, trained even in terror not to raise their voices. The youngest, a novice named Agnes, barely 16 years old, fainted and would not wake, her body going slack across the cold flagstones. When the doors finally gave way, not picked, but battered down with improvised rams, the soldiers moved with efficiency that suggested this was not their first convent. They stripped the altar first, hands that had held weapons now pulling chalices and candlesticks from their sacred places. The small golden reliquary that held a fragment of bone the sisters had venerated for over 100 years was pried open. The relic dumped carelessly on the floor, the gold container worth more than the sacred thing it had held. Then they turned their attention to the women. What happened next? Sister Katerina's testimony describes only in fragments, the language breaking down as memory confronted what words could not adequately contain. Her habit was torn from her. She was dragged by her hair across stones she had swept every morning for 5 years. She heard screaming from the dormitory above, voices she recognized, distorted by fear and pain. When she tried to run toward those voices, sisterhood stronger than self-preservation, she was struck so hard across the face that she lost consciousness. When she woke hours later in the cellar where she had been thrown, she was alone with 3 other sisters. All were injured. All were silent. A silence that Sister Katerina's testimony suggests was more profound than simple shokit, was the silence of women who had lost the vocabulary to describe what they had just endured. The pattern repeated across the city with sickening consistency, but with variations that reveal the calculated nature of the violence. At the convent of Santa Maria in Trastevere, soldiers set fire to the wooden choir stalls to smoke out women hiding in the upper galleries. The choice was suffocation, burning, or descent into the hands of armed men. Parish records from Santo Spirito note that 7 nuns died of violence and flame on May 7th alone. Though the precise manner of death goes unrecorded either, because the parish priest could not determine it from the remains, or because he could not bring himself to write what he knew. A letter from Marco Foscari, Venetian ambassador, to his doge, dated May 15th and smuggled out through the port at Ostia, catalogues the destruction with the flat tone of profound shock. The convents are emptied or burned. The women within have suffered such outrages as I cannot in good conscience detail in this letter. Safe to say that the sacred and the profane have been made indistinguishable, and many are dead. Those who live may wish they were not. The city that was the heart of Christendom now resembles something from the pagan past, when temples were sacked and priestesses violated as acts of conquest. I have seen war, your serenity, in many forms. This is something else. But here's what makes this horror distinct from the inevitable atrocities of 16th century warfare. Was allowed to continue for days. While the initial breach was chaotic, what followed was systematic. Soldiers returned to convents they had already ransacked, this time looking not for valuables but for women they had missed the first time. They searched cellars, attics, gardens. They tore up floorboards looking for hiding places. Contemporary military dispatches preserved in Spanish archives show that some commanders issued orders to cease attacks on religious houses by May 8th. But these orders were ignored or openly defied. The calculus was brutally simple. There was no one to enforce discipline, no one to punish transgressions, and an implicit understanding among the troops that plunder of all kinds was their payment for months of unpaid service. The women who tried to resist left traces in the archaeological record that speak across centuries. When restorers worked on the convent of Sant'Agostino in the 1890s, they found beneath layers of later renovation a doorframe scored with deep gouges axe marks. The wood split and splintered from repeated blows. Behind that door, they uncovered a small room, barely large enough for 3 people to stand, where the skeletal remains of 2 women were found, along with scraps of religious habit, a rosary with beads scattered across the floor, and a small knife, the kind used for cutting bread, clutched in the hand bones of one skeleton. No names, no record in any surviving register. Just bones and the violence written into wood, preserved by accident across 4 centuries. A silent testimony to a last stand that no one recorded and no one survived to describe. The psychological landscape of these attacks demands attention because it reveals something crucial about how systematic dehumanization functions, even especially in religious contexts. Many of the soldiers were Catholic. The Spanish tercios were drawn from Castile and Aragon, regions of deep religious orthodoxy where the Inquisition held power and heresy was punished by fire. Yet religious identity provided no protection to the women they encountered. In depositions taken later during half-hearted military tribunals, survivors describe soldiers making deliberate mockery of sacred rituals as they assaulted nuns, forcing them to recite prayers, demanding they bless their attackers, creating obscene parodies of confession. It was not enough to take what they wanted. They needed to desecrate what these women represented. German Landsknechts, many of whom held Lutheran sympathies and had spent years listening to sermons about papal corruption, reportedly justified their actions as punishment against a church that sold salvation and grew fat on indulgences. The convents became theaters where every grudge against institutional religion, every resentment about priestly wealth and moral hypocrisy, could be enacted on the bodies of individual women who had nothing to do with Vatican policy and everything to do with genuine faith. The cruelty had ideological decoration, but at its core was simply the oldest story of warfare: armed men with opportunity and impunity. And then there were the fires. Not accidental blazes from overturned candles or the chaos of looting, but intentional conflagrations. The convent of San Cosamato was torched on May 9, 3 full days after the initial breach, with women still inside. Multiple witnesses describe seeing figures at upper windows, shapes moving behind smoke, silhouettes against flame. Whether they jumped or burned, the result appears the same in the burial records. 12 women from San Cosamato listed simply as consumed by fire, their bodies never properly identified for individual graves. They were buried in a common pit in the convent garden. And 2 centuries later, when that garden was excavated for construction, workers found a mass of calcined bone that confirmed the written record. The decision to burn convents served multiple purposes, all of them calculated. It destroyed evidence of what had happened inside. It eliminated potential witnesses who might later identify attackers. It was a form of terror, the smoke visible across the city, a message that nowhere was safe. And most grimly, it was faster and more efficient than murder by blade or blow, requiring less personal engagement with the act of killing. For those who survived the initial violence, Spirit nightmare began one that in some ways lasted longer and cut deeper. Many nuns were taken as captives, held for ransom, or simply kept as property by soldiers who treated them as part of their plunder. No different from the silver candlesticks and silk altar cloths. A merchant's diary from June 1527, kept by a Florentine trader named Benvenuto, who had been trapped in Rome during the sack, describes seeing women in torn religious garments being led through streets in chains, some visibly pregnant, all silent. He writes, "They walked with eyes downcast, as they had been taught, but this obedience now served a different master. I confess, I wept to see it." The ransom demands sent to noble families are catalogued in notarial archives throughout Italy, precise lists of names, convents of origin, and sums required for return. Some families paid. The Orsini family reportedly spent 3,000 ducats to recover 2 daughters and a niece from the convent of Santa Lucia. Other families could not afford the sums demanded, and some would not pay, unwilling to acknowledge what had happened to their daughters. The stain of violation perceived as worse than death. Those women simply vanished from the historical record, absorbed into an aftermath, too chaotic and too shameful to track every individual tragedy. The papal response was paralyzed by the Pope's own captivity. Clement VII, trapped in Castel Sant'Angelo while his city burned, could issue no effective orders, dispatch no troops, offer no rescue. His subsequent letters, once he secured release in December through negotiation and the payment of a massive ransom, reveal a man struggling to comprehend the scale of destruction and his own failure to prevent it. He writes of unspeakable acts against brides of Christ, using the evasive language of euphemism, because, to be specific, would be to confront a failure of protection so total it shook the foundations of papal authority. The Church's power, it turned out, rested on an assumption of inviolability that dissolved the moment armed men decided to ignore it. In the months that followed, Rome became a city of ghosts and paperwork. The population had dropped from perhaps 55,000 before the sack to fewer than 20,000 by autumn. The rest fled, dead, or carried off. Convents that survived in any form began the grim accounting. Sisters dead, sisters missing, sisters alive but broken, property destroyed, endowments plundered. The petitions they filed with the papal chancery read like inventories of loss, but between the lines of bureaucratic language you can read the architecture of shattered lives. The convent of Santa Chiara reported that of 32 sisters and residents on May 6, only 18 could be accounted for by August. Of those 18, 6 had lost their reason and could no longer participate in religious life, a clinical phrase for women who had retreated into catatonia, who screamed at shadows, who could not bear to be touched. The petition requests funds not just for rebuilding walls, but for care of these women, whose injuries were not visible but were no less real than broken bones. Some women rebuilt with remarkable resilience. The abbess of San Lorenzo, a woman named Julia Orsini, whose family wielded significant political power in Rome and beyond, used her connections to secure funds for reconstruction. Her correspondence shows pragmatic determination. She negotiated for armed guards to be permanently stationed at her convent. She had iron bars installed on all ground floor windows, doors reinforced with metal plating, and most tellingly, she moved her community to a new location away from major thoroughfares. She was acknowledging through architecture that the old assumptions about sacred protection were dead, and survival required fortress mentality. Other communities never recovered. The convent of Sant'Anna simply ceased to exist. Its last entry in city records notes dissolved. Following the troubles of 27, a bland administrative phrase for the end of a community that had existed for 200 years. The building was eventually sold to a merchant family and converted to a palazzo. If you walk through certain neighborhoods of Rome today, you're passing buildings that were once houses of prayer, their histories erased by renovation and time. The legal aftermath dragged on for decades and satisfied almost no one. Tribunals were convened, but few soldiers were prosecuted. Many had died in the plague of 1527. Others were needed for imperial wars, and justice became a matter of political convenience. Charles V expressed regret but took no real action. Restitution was promised but rarely paid, widening the gap between acknowledged harm and meaningful remedy. Yet the women who suffered found ways to testify beyond official channels. In convent chronicles, family letters, and confessor notes, fragments of their witness endured. A nun named Sebastiana wrote in 1531 of nightmares, boots on stone. I am afraid in ways I never was before I learned what men can do when God turns his face away. These scattered accounts form a counter-history, revealing the lasting psychological wounds beneath rebuilt walls and resumed routines. What lingers about the sack of Rome is not only the collapse of order, but the duration and complicity. For 8 days, violence went largely unchecked while diplomats barricaded themselves. Clergy hid and authorities fled. When order returned through exhaustion and plague not intervention, the reckoning was shallow. The women most harmed received the least agency. Their traumas were folded into narratives of empire, papal weakness, and religious conflict, reduced to footnotes rather than treated as specific crimes against specific lives. In 1923, archaeologists found a faint inscription in the former convent of Santa Caterina da Siena, Sumus Hic, Fidelis, Aramis, Memento Nostri. We were here. Remember us. It, too, was later lost. The stones forget. The archives remember only in fragments. And in those fragments lies a truth. Sanctuary is only as strong as the will to defend it, and the most vulnerable remain those history most easily sets aside.